Alrighty, now we've got time for the next session, which I'm actually super looking forward to, so thank you very much. Just around financially quantifying cyber risk. So it's going to be an interesting case study into an insurance company. So talking through essentially calculating in my opinion, a really, really difficult task of assessing what the cost of reputational damage might look like for post-breach or operational downtime. So if we could all have a warm round of applause for Sergeja Slapnicher from UQ. Excellent. Have a warm round of applause for Sergeja, thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm really excited to be here and also honored, and I'll present you our research in an insurance company. Over the past 4 years, my colleagues and I had the privilege to interview over 80 cybersecurity experts across the world in all 3 lines of defense: frontline managers, chief information security officers, and IT auditors. Among those were 25 executive and non-executive directors who are ultimately accountable for cybersecurity in the companies. We ask cybersecurity experts how they assess cyber risks, and we ask directors how they understand what cyber risks their organization is exposed to. Now you already know what I'm going to say. How cyber risks are assessed and reported to directors is not the way how they would understand them, because they come from another language group. They speak finance. Right, and here's a quote from one of the directors. He said, in general, you can say it's fear that drives cyber risk management, because it's very clear that there is a risk which is perceived to be unmanageable. And this was a chairman of a risk committee in a bank. A case in point is a testimony of another executive director who said to me, Sergeja, our CISO came to me to ask for approval of a major IT investment infrastructure, and he said, we won't be secure if we don't have that. I don't want to be an obstacle in cybersecurity, but I really don't understand its value. Yet another chairman of the board of directors said, we are not in position to say what our risk appetite is because we cannot financially quantify cyber risk. And we haven't come across a sensible way to quantify it. And even if we think that our CISO manages risks well, how he derives those priorities, we cannot reconcile, and that's a fundamental problem. So what would they like to know? What would top leadership like to know? What cyber risks are we exposed to? How much it would cost? How likely they are? And if we invest a certain amount of money in countermeasures, how much have we brought down our exposure? Such simple questions from their perspective, but so difficult to answer. And I can sympathize with them because I was for over 11 years on various boards of directors, but back then cybersecurity was not so topical as it is now, but I do understand what they do and how they need to understand things. Why would they like to understand cyber risk financially quantified? Because that's not the only risk that they need to manage or oversee. There can be many risks. For example, for small or micro companies, the survival is the most important risk. Or right now for large companies, for exporters, tariffs or geopolitical risks. So they need to allocate resources to each of those risks, and that should be in proportion to how important those risks are. And financially quantifying those risks is a common denominator to all these risks. They need to negotiate cyber insurance contracts, so they need to understand what losses could be and made of what elements, because insurance contracts come with excesses, and they need to understand how to best negotiate those contracts. Also, because they are measured with financial indicators, they would like to understand return on these investments, which are huge, as they would like to understand return on investments of anything else they invest into. And in financial institutions like banks or insurance companies, the prudential regulation actually requires them to financially quantify all of the risks, to provide sufficient capital in case of a catastrophic event, and to cover for losses and protect all the stakeholders and the economy at large. What came out in those interviews is this pyramid. So how cyber risk is assessed in the company is this. In the first line, frontline managers or CISO identify hundreds of cyber risk in an organization. They seem to be transient. They keep them in their private ledgers because there are so many that they can't even populate the enterprise risk management metrics because they would totally overwhelm it. So for example, in the company where we made this research, they came up with nearly 1,000 cyber risks. They said 29 of them are beyond our tolerance levels, and even they were too many to bring into the enterprise risk metrics because you can't come out to the board of directors just with cyber risk. There are other risks as well. And if you ask the internal auditors in the same company how many cyber risks there are, they would say there's just one cyber risk. It's permanent, it's in all processes, it's critical, and it doesn't go away. It's all the time on our agenda. So how confusing is that for directors? And what they are reported to is usually enterprise risk metrics or register, and which is obsolete for all these risk experts because they have their own ledgers. They manage or assess and keep their records for themselves. Definitely, that is not something that would make it easy for directors. So today I'm going to present our research in an insurance company because we are under strict NDA agreement. I cannot reveal which company that is because I'm going to reveal a few other details. We did this project together with Chaitanya Joshi. He's a statistician from New Zealand. He's a specialist in fraud statistics. And Uroš Just used to be an IT auditor in the United States, in Deloitte. Since he moved to Slovenia, he's a partner in Forvis Mazars. And myself, I'm Sergeja Slapničar. I'm associate professor in accounting at the University of Queensland. Now you might ask, how can an accountant talk about cyber risk quantification? I did my research in performance measurement before, risk management, before I pivoted 5 years ago to cybersecurity. And cyber risk management is just like we do investment risk management or like we measure investments. It's something in the future, and it's something quite difficult to measure. Now, the definition of cyber risk by NIST, I'm sure that in this room everybody knows it very well. We boiled it down to 3 factors for cyber risk quantification. Cyber risk is the likelihood that a threat will materialize, which is conditional upon the likelihood that controls that a company has in place will fail, or vulnerabilities. And then this is multiplied by the impact on an organization, which has to be expressed in financial terms. Most of you are also probably well acquainted with the ISO standard 27005, which defines how cyber risks are to be assessed. But by no means this standard requires cyber risk quantification. It does suggest you can do it or you can do semi-quantification, but I would call it calculation because all the inputs into any quantification model are still very subjective because everything's going to happen in the future. So we do not have any objective data which we could feed into our models. Even if we took objective data of another company, that just doesn't fit into for this particular company because cyber risk environment is idiosyncratic, meaning that it's particular. It depends on the effectiveness of controls in the place in this organization, as well as on the value of data in this organization and critical processes in this particular organization. This standard defines 2 approaches to cyber risk assessment. The first one is asset-based approach. I'm saying the first one because it's been in place also prior to 2022 when the standard was updated. And that's the approach that cyber experts usually take, and this is why they come up with hundreds of risks, because it's a very detailed approach, which is very granular. It depends on identification of digital assets, threats that could jeopardize them, and vulnerabilities that they could be prone to, and therefore it is very suitable for estimation of probability of a cyber risk, but not at all suitable for the estimation of financial impact because it's too granular. And we cannot ascribe financial impact to a single digital asset. Moreover, we realize that in many organizations, data is not even considered or measured as a digital asset, neither is its value considered because even in accounting, that is just some sort of a black box, totally ignored for now. The second approach in the standard is the so-called scenario-based approach. Many organizations use it as a second approach or a complementary approach, but the two approaches actually need to be combined. So the scenario-based approach is envisioning a certain strategic scenario that could happen in an organization, the most plausible one, that could happen to critical processes and critical data, and linking that to digital assets that support those critical processes. And this approach is very appropriate to estimate financial data because it's comprehensive and it relates to entire organization. How many of you have heard of the FAIR model, Factor Analysis of Information Risk? Yeah, quite some. That is perhaps the most known quantification model. This is from the article in the ISACA journal. Vohradsky made it. And we quite like that model. Actually, our model is somewhat similar to this model. It requires decomposition of cyber risk to loss event frequency and to loss magnitude. And then further down, loss magnitude to primary losses and secondary losses. And primary losses are out-of-pocket costs, whereas secondary losses are reputational costs. And then loss event frequency is further decomposed to threat event frequency and vulnerabilities. But when it comes to estimation of cyber risk, first of all, I think we could not understand it, how it could relate to more cyber risks, and we said cyber risks are many. And secondly, it is somewhat ambiguous in the space of how you get from vulnerabilities to threat and to probability of the event, and how does it model interrelatedness of risks and controls. We don't think it does, and this is what we try to model in our approach. So the way we approached is the following: probability assessment, and that's phase number one. So probability, one way, is one phase, impact assessment is another phase. We approach with so-called fault tree analysis, and that is a method known from engineering. And it's actually a diagram where it illustrates all possible causes of system failure. It has been used before, and it has been used in cybersecurity as well. It's called attack trees in cybersecurities, but because we are trying to model also for non-malicious incidents, we still prefer to call it the fault tree analysis. However, it has been used only for the estimation of probability and not for financial impact. And for financial impact, we will need to use something else. And it was used for relatively limited or constrained systems. So talking about cybersecurity, cyber incident is a top event, and what leads to that top event could be several threats, and these threats are independent. So they are in some sort of an or relationship. Anything can happen. And each of the threats is protected by controls, is defended by certain controls, and these controls can also be either related or not. If they are related, then they are in a so-called end relationship. That means that a perpetrator needs to break through all of the controls because they are layered before a threat can materialize. But if controls are non-related, then a perpetrator needs to just break one and the threat will materialize. That has implications for probability, because if controls are layered and related, then we need to multiply their probabilities, and the probability of a threat to materialize is actually much lower than probability of any of the controls failing, because that's the product of probabilities. Okay, that's a good news. But the bad news is when controls are not related, and therefore a perpetrator can come through any gate, because in that case, controls probabilities add up, and which means that the probability of threat is much higher than the probability of any of the control failing. And this is what we considered in our estimate. Many fault tree analyses are sort of taken in a deterministic way, meaning that an event can happen or not, it occurs or not. But that's a very strong assumption, because there's a high uncertainty behind the control failing. And this is what we also try to model, is this uncertainty. To model uncertainty with a certain distribution curve, we need several estimates. And these estimates will be expert estimates, because this has not happened yet. And it hasn't happened for us in our modeling, and it hasn't happened whoever uses the FAIR model. It needs to be based on experts' estimates. So this is what we add up, and we call that Bayesian analysis of the fault tree. In this insurance company, we had the support of the board of directors chairman of risk committee, of executive manager who's responsible for cybersecurity, and that was very beneficial for this research project. We signed up an NDA agreement. We said we are going to spread and disseminate the knowledge of our method, if you allow. So we did it as a research project, not as a consultancy project. With that support, we could have interviews with all people who are involved in cybersecurity risk management. We could inspect all the documents, how they assess cyber risks, how their business impact analysis, their stress test, their risk registers, and everything. So we understood what's going on and how they normally approach. Then we organized workshops with 18 people. 10 people were in the so-called cybersecurity group, and 10 people were in a so-called business line group. But two persons were the same. That was the risk manager and the CISO were in both groups, so to participate in this workshop. What did we do in the workshops? First of all, we defined the scenarios for which we will assess, quantify cyber risk. And the first scenario, and that stems from their stress test, was the ransomware attack, which would result in a data breach. And we envisaged that would be a ransom would be requested, but because company was somewhat hesitant to pay, it would come to the disclosure of sensitive information for 20% of customers in 3 critical portfolios. Now you already see where this is heading. As soon as we define portfolios or critical processes or critical data, we already give up on everything else that's possible. And that is the deficiency. But we just cannot handle everything, because even within this scenario, there are so many options. For that reason, we need to focus on most plausible scenarios for what is most important to this company and to top leadership of this company. The second scenario was a ransomware attack. Admittedly, perhaps it will seem to you somewhat exaggerated, 5-day operational downtime. But we said anything shorter might not have had such an effect on the customers who are in life insurance, because they do not so often interact with the company. And as it then later came, like what we found out later is also that this scenario can be much better controlled and defended against or contained than the data breach. Once the data goes out, the damage is really high. In the next step, we ask in our workshop our cybersecurity experts, 10 of them who are in different parts of the organization, which threats could lead to data breach, and they came up with 8 threats. And for the operational downtime, they came up with 11 threats. So in total, there were 12 threats. Not all of them were the same. For example, for the operational downtime, it could be equipment failure, it could be a natural disaster, or something else. So threats differed a little bit between the 2 scenarios. Then we asked them which controls they have in place to protect against each threat, and they came up with a list of 27 controls. Admittedly, these controls were quite high level, and already that was quite sophisticated. They were not so granular. They didn't go down to hundreds of controls. For each of the controls, then we asked the CISO, and that was checked with our team member, Uroš, how the controls are interrelated, which controls need to be broken through for each threat to materialize. And he came up with a structure which we then illustrated in a fault tree model. And for each threat, that was different. So for example, for malicious employee, the controls were different. Some of the controls were different than they were for social engineering. So there was a very complex fault tree model, which I cannot present on one slide because it's just too much, but just beyond every threat, there was a fault tree. In step 3, we ask each of those 10 people to individually indicate the plausible range of probabilities for each of control failing. We ask them to just indicate control failure probability for those controls that they are familiar with. We assisted them with KPIs or key risk indicators of the effectiveness of those controls. The company doesn't have key risk indicators for each of the controls, so that was also that came out as a deficiency which the company needs to work on to assist managers in the future to sort of measure the effectiveness of all the controls. And when they came up with that, we fitted those estimates to a beta distribution and then ran Monte Carlo simulation with 100,000 values, so to come up with the distribution curve. I need to also say that they estimated those probabilities anonymously, so they were only known to us, researchers, but not to the company. Because the moment when you ask a person who is responsible for certain control, what's the probability of failure, they underestimate it. There are various biases. Why? First is controllability. When I drive, we are safer than when somebody else is driving, that sort of controllability. Second, optimistic bias. But one bias is also accountability bias, because if they are accountable for that control, they sometimes tend to underreport the risk. And that is exactly what the internal auditor in this company felt. He said the risks are underreported. Often we need to overdrive the likelihood. In the next step, they were asked to assess the likelihood of threats targeting this organization. And there we used the scale that they normally use in this company, and that's a qualitative scale, from 1, rarely, to 5, almost certain. And they ascribed certain values to that. And we translated those values into numerical values, lambdas, how often that can happen per year. And then we plotted those values to a gamma distribution, and then again ran Monte Carlo simulation to get 100,000 values. But that is just the probability of a threat targeting the organization, not the probability of threat materializing, because that probability depends or is conditional upon controls failing. And when we computed that, then we came up with a different probability. Now, here are some descriptive results. It does not really matter which controls are the weakest in this company, but it was a revealing exercise. For example, there were 27 controls. We excluded then 2 because they were not defending controls. They were, I think, corrective controls. But what is really interesting is that I report here the median estimate of the likelihood of failure of this control, and the highest median estimate was 16.8%. That seems quite reasonable, doesn't it? Because from the very same article from the ISACA journal by Wochracki about the FAIR model, Wochracki says a likelihood of up to 20% is still unlikely. That's still green area of risk. But you will see when this is propagated in the fault tree model, how alarming that probability can then become. So far so good. We were happy with the results. Everything seemed normal. Now here are the probabilities of threats targeting these companies based on the opinion or expert estimates by 10 experts of cybersecurity in this company. So who else could do that better? They are informed, they know the company, they know the environment. What do you say? What's the probability of data breach if the company wouldn't have any controls in place? What's the probability? What? Just say something. Exactly, it's 100%, because alone social engineering is 100% probability. And then there is non-malicious employee who would make a mistake, 94%, and you need to know that these probabilities add up, so definitely 100%. But when we take into account the controls that defend that, these controls come down. Now, almost all probabilities of threats come down to under 10%, under 20% for one control, and that is unauthorized access. But for social engineering, it remains pretty high at 44%. But according to Wochracki, that's still just the medium range of risk, medium range of likelihood, so the yellow range, the amber. But when we add up this, what do you think how likely it is that this would materialize? That was shocking to us, 71.6%. Because these probabilities actually add up. It might be high, you might not believe, also we might not believe in that, but then we need to go back and we need to say how to improve our cyber risk quantification modeling. Do we have the right relationship in place in our fault tree model? Are controls related as we model them? Are they, seemingly their probabilities did not seem to be too high. But then, how are they modeled? and what to do. So we identified which are the weakest controls, how they are put in place. And such a fault tree model speaks exactly to what Jess Mondini said this morning. Step number 1, try to map your transition paths. And that is such a good idea that we also fully support. But that is just a probability. It can happen from anything from nearly 0 to 1% to 100%. In assessment of financial impact, we worked on that with the business line people, and we relied on so-called business impact analysis. The business impact analysis is analysis of scenarios that can impact critical business processes, which are prioritized by top management by analyzing all possible consequences, operational, reputational, legal, that such scenarios can cause. So it is critical to identify critical assets, critical portfolios. We relied as much as we could on the accounting information from their system, and that was about the number of customers, contracts that they have in place, financial return on their contracts. We calculated customer lifetime value, because if you lose a customer who is insured for 20 years in life insurance, you lose 20 years of cash flow from that customer. So what we tried to elicit from our expert group was the estimates of how many customers would leave, how many customers would not join in the next year that were budgeted to join, how many customers we would need to give discount to keep them, how many customers would get involved in the class action and settlements. These were the estimates that we did. And again, as you can see in the 3 critical portfolios, the medians actually differ, meaning that customers have different sensitivities in different portfolios to what data would be lost and how sensitive that is for them. Losses that were out-of-pocket costs, like upgrading the IT system, cost of personnel, external advisors, legal costs, and regulatory penalties, were not elicited from expert judgment, but were collated in the company based on records that they have, based on actual data if they have it in place, or some estimates. So that was collated by the risk management and the CISO. Here's the pie chart. I'm not going to report the absolute amounts, but just relative amounts. Here's the pie chart. The absolute amounts were hundreds of $millions. All the blue costs are costs that relate to reputation and loss of trust of customers. And there were 91% of losses. Out-of-pocket costs were just 9% of all losses, including the ransom. And these were based on the median estimate of lost customer, which was in the range of 0 to 10%. Because we found these losses very high, we went to check with other literature whether these estimates are not exaggerated, and they don't seem to be exaggerated. The loss of 10% of customers or below, one can reasonably expect. However, if the company is insured, in particular in this case, the losses could come down to 1/4 of them, but could not be entirely recovered, because insurance companies typically do not insure against the future losses of future customers. If we take into account customer lifetime value and their cash flows, then the losses are in magnitude of 3, of the factor 3, so 3 times larger. And now 97% of losses becomes losses of reputation and trust, or the loss of customers. Now, this is the likelihood impact curve. What I was presenting was the median estimate. And what the median estimate and financial impact obviously depends on the frequency of basically customers leaving, not settling, not joining. But with some smaller probability, these losses could be higher, because there would be if the percentage of customers leaving is 20%, then losses are obviously higher. But if it's lower than that, then losses are smaller. Unfortunately, it wasn't possible to retrieve from Australian notorious cases what their loss of customers were. And yes, what are the lessons learned and some challenges? First of all, even if you think that's way too sophisticated for you and you don't need that, I would still suggest to do some improvements into cyber risk assessment. First of all, consider control interconnectedness and try to map it, because it really impacts how you estimate the likelihood. And secondly, if you have more than one estimate, then that is definitely beneficial, because that would somehow reflect the uncertainty. If you think you have the best person in place to estimate the likelihood, that's all right. However, it's just 1 point estimate, and it has nothing to do with statistics. We call it personal probability, not statistical probability. Of course, the challenge is to try to quantify these estimates. With the estimation of financial impact, we often saw in our interviews that cybersecurity experts are actually required to do financial estimation, but I think that cybersecurity experts are not the best to ask, because they are business line people who are the best to ask, as they know the processes, they know their customers, they know their sensitivities, they know what's behind their data. So another thing is to put in live documents that are already in the company, like business impact analysis, and rely on that in a scenario of cyber risk assessment. And then do not forget to consider losses of trust and reputation, because they may actually outweigh the out-of-pocket costs, and that has been also proven in other studies where it was studied how cyber incidents affect share prices, and these are definitely not the losses to underestimates. Of course, the challenge is, and also perhaps not solvable, the subjectivity. Sometimes you would get somebody who's really who would really provide extreme values, and this still is based on subjectivity, and with improving, with recording KPIs of effectiveness, with training people to be more consistent, we might actually improve that process. But maybe that's a too hard job for just one company. Maybe it would be good to somehow collaborate in some sort of consortium on the industry level, just like organizations already do in some other spaces. And here's my question actually for you and for our discussion. Is financial quantification of cyber risks worth the effort, and can it be integrated in cyber risk management? I would think yes, in some organizations, definitely is. But perhaps in smaller organizations, they do not have resources, but they would definitely benefit from perhaps some estimate of how many customers live in their industry or something like that. Thank you very much, and I'm happy to answer your questions.
Thank you, Sergeja. That's amazing. Can I have a round of applause for Sergeja, please? That was really good. I was captivated, absolutely captivated.
Thank you.
And I have so many questions. I'll definitely hit you up after, and we just won't make it Lucas's question round. So the one thing I do have a question is, obviously, one of your first slides was, it was like 943 risks or something like that from memory. And which one of those risks do you take out, run through the process, and like what's good or what's bad, or obviously you can't run all 943, you'll just be there all year. So what's, in your opinion, the best middle ground?
I think that those risks were risks that were based on digital assets. So these were risks that sometimes cybersecurity experts deal by themselves. Even they don't even report them, because they are recorded, they are in their ledgers, they are transient, they manage them, but they aren't the ones, they are so granular, they aren't the ones on which we could estimate financial impact. We need to estimate financial impact where we envisage a scenario, because otherwise there's just no way how you can come down to any such thing as loss of customers for just one asset. So I would say, because they don't think about that second part, financial estimation, they are, like, in their world, they are technical risks, and they are recorded as such, and they are managed as such.
Yeah, fantastic. And it's on the risk register, it's fine, right? So obviously. Anyway, we do have some questions online, so if you are using the app, please ask through that, but I will be also running around if anyone has a question in the room. So the first one is, what would you recommend to consider when the organization is choosing, 1, adopt your model/method, or 2, adopt FAIR, or 3, do not do quantitative risk assessment?
Sorry, what was the question?
So essentially, what would you recommend? Either use your model, use FAIR, or do nothing at all, just generally speaking, for any organization?
I wouldn't say that there is any controversy between our model and the FAIR model. It's just that our model is much more elaborated in that area, where FAIR model is actually not so elaborated. So that area we really sort of expand, and we map those risks and we put them into relationship. Whereas the FAIR model is quite similar in the financial impact estimation. It speaks about secondary and primary losses, but we just want to say that secondary losses should not even have that label, because they are the primary losses, because they are much more they are much larger than out-of-pocket costs like upgrading IT systems. But anyway, that's just a small like linguistic thing. And not to estimate, I said, for all organizations that's of course not feasible because they just don't have the expertise. But I would say, forget about doing Bayesian statistics. Don't do it because it's all based on, but just try to think about correlations or independence of controls and how they are correlated with the threats and try to somehow map that because I think that is the beneficial exercise of this. And just alone through these workshops, came to, like, first of all, people were discussing which are the risks, which are the controls that all of them see as the weakest. That was already something that was really value added of this exercise. Of course, they will now discuss it and they might adapt it for their stress test. But that, I mean, just alone the exercise, even if we let out the Bayesian statistics, just alone the exercise would be quite good.
Cool, thank you. And we've got a few more questions here as well. So is a controls assurance program or similar an essential requirement to underpin the ability to effectively quantify cyber risk in financial terms, e.g. measuring design and operational effectiveness of controls?
I don't quite understand this question. So is control assurance imperative or something like that?
Yeah, so if I'm reading it correctly as well, is controls assurance program similar? And James, if you're in a room and you have maybe some additional kind of points to make, there we go. Let me do straight from the source instead of me trying to interpret.
Thanks. This is scary being on the room. So controls assurance program, so understanding the design effectiveness and operational effectiveness of the controls for your specific program around the probability assessment parts. It was very control focused, so I suppose you would need to have that understanding of your controls, whether they're weak or strong.
No, I understand you. Thank you. Yes. You see, in this company, they did not have the control assurance for all the controls. They actually have control assurance just a few controls. And again, another message that came through is that they need to sort of more systematically track control effectiveness. Otherwise, it's quite impossible to predict control failure. And therefore, but even if we had control assurance for all of the controls, the step from objective control assurance, such as how many people fail in the phishing test or something technical, to the likelihood that control will fail is still a subjective step, and we have to be aware of that. It's not an objective step. There is no formula that brings us from the KPI effectiveness to the likelihood of failure, because there are so many. That's a future, right? So, but definitely it would inform managers, and it would also certainly, I mean, even give legitimacy, because that's one important consideration, legitimacy, how we do that, because even if we fail, we need to show duty of care.
Cool, thank you. Right, so cyber insurance companies must have models for estimating probability and cost. Is this something others can leverage?
Come again.
Yeah, so if you're a financial institution, you have to have some of these things in place. Do you see other organizations maybe leveraging this as well who don't have it mandated?
Yeah. Good question. This was an insurance company, and it is mandated to have this in place, and they have stress tests. But their stress test was based on a single point estimate. They basically, there was a risk manager and the CISO who prepare all the inputs, so it was based on two people input. Well, they collated information a little bit. So when we started this exercise, we sort of leveraged that, what they already had in place, and we tried to improve it. We tried to improve it, and we made it so that they will be able to use it in the future, because they have many actuarians. They are actually able to do Bayesian statistics if they wanted to, and they were committed to that. But whether other companies could use, I don't know, because that is proprietary information. However, what could be done is to do something like that for the whole insurance sector, because, for example, the likelihood of a churn rate for the customers across portfolios like life insurance or property insurance could be quite similar, and these estimates could be then leveraged to other companies.
Yeah, thank you. And there's a load more questions on there, but we are out of time. But I'll kind of ask a question from my side, and kind of touches on a few of the ones I'm seeing here. So it was quite heavy in terms of resourcing. from that perspective, and not a lot of companies have the budgets as of an insurance company or a large financial institution. Is there something that you've seen, or is there like a cool spreadsheet or something like that, or even white paper that people can have a look at and maybe potentially leverage?
Yeah, we are preparing a paper. It should be finished by July, and then we'll try to publish it. If you contact me, I'm happy to send you this paper where everything will be described as a process. I do know that it's heavy in terms of resources along the people that we ask to provide information. But for them, it was not more than 2 hours, and that's once a year, or let's say, I don't think it even needs to be completed every year, maybe every 2 or 3 years, because that management would only like to understand a ballpark estimate, like is that 200 million or is it 50 million? You see what I mean? And how likely it is, and where are our weaknesses. So this could be how it can be simplified, and then you can just simplify by perhaps involving less people, because there are less people in your organization. The important thing is perhaps to get some second opinion, or to also get business line people to do their part of assessment.
Yeah, thank you. And I've got so many more questions, but we are out of time, and many questions in the app. Are you going to be around?
Yeah, I'll be around for the next 2 days, and I'm really happy to answer all your questions. Or if you would be considering this to doing on an industry level, that's namely our next research project. We would actually like to do this for an industry. Yeah, okay, and that would be then again a learning lesson which we would be able to communicate. What we learned, how could we do that, how could we do the templates here, for example, for stress testing or something similar. I know that I said before it's idiosyncratic, it pertains like controls and effectiveness of controls are different in different organizations, but nevertheless perhaps something could be done from where we could borrow.
Yeah, excellent.
Thank
So we are just about to break for lunch, but before we do that, can we give a massive round of applause to Sergeja, please?
Thank you very much.